April 19, 1989, 9:53 a.m., 330 nautical miles northeast of Puerto Rico. The Atlantic Ocean was a flat, shimmering mirror of indifferent blue, betraying nothing of the inferno raging inside the steel beast breaking its surface. Inside the number 2 turret of the USS Iowa, the air didn't just smell of burning cordite and roasted meat. It tasted of it. A thick, oily smoke, blacker than a moonless midnight, churned against the armored bulkheads, trapping the heat that had just reached 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit in a fraction of a second. There was no sound anymore within the gunhouse, only the terrifying silence of the dead, broken by the distant, muffled klaxons screaming from the ship's main deck. Just moments ago, 47 men had been shouting, sweating, and working the complex hydraulic levers and brass controls of a machine designed in the 1930s to hurl 2,700-pound shells over the horizon. Now they were gone, not just killed, but erased by a pressure wave that had turned the interior of the turret into a blast furnace. Up on the bridge, Captain Fred Mussoli watched with a sickening, hollow feeling in his gut as a lethargic puff of smoke drifted from the center gun barrel, followed seconds later by a jagged tongue of flame licking up from the turret officer's booth. The USS Iowa, the Big Stick, the invincible dreadnought that had frightened the Japanese Imperial Navy and shelled the coast of Korea, was burning from the inside out. The physics of 16-inch naval gunfire, usually the source of the ship's supreme authority, had turned inward. What the admirals on the bridge didn't yet know, what the damage control team sprinting across the teat decks were about to discover, was that the greatest threat to the Iowa wasn't a Soviet anti-ship missile or a rogue torpedo. It was a microscopic exchange of electrons, a ghost in the machine, a spark of static electricity nestled between silk bags of propellant that had destabilized the delicate balance between controlled combustion and catastrophic detonation. The invincible ship had been crippled by something smaller than a grain of sand. To understand the horror of that April morning, one must first understand the machine itself. The number 2 turret of an Iowa-class battleship is not merely a weapon. It is an industrial cathedral dedicated to the god of kinetic energy, weighing over 1,700 tons more than the entire displacement of a World War II destroyer. The turret is a rotating armored fortress extending 5 decks down into the bowels of the ship. It is a closed ecosystem of hydraulic pumps, electric motors, projectile hoists, and powder cars, all encased in Class A steel armor up to 17 inches thick. This armor was designed to shrug off the heaviest shells the Japanese Yamato class could throw at it. It was built to keep the enemy out. But on April 19, 1989, that same armor served a darker purpose. It kept the explosion in. It focused the blast, magnifying the pressure, turning the gunhouse into a pressure cooker where the laws of thermodynamics were applied to human flesh with impartial cruelty. The men inside Turret 2 were serving a technology that had reached its zenith in 1945, a technology of gears and pulleys and manual labor that seemed almost steampunk in the age of digital targeting and Tomahawk missiles. They were the acolytes of the 16-inch gun, the largest weapon ever mounted on a U.S. warship, capable of firing a projectile the weight of a Volkswagen Beetle, a distance of 24 miles. When those guns spoke, they created a shockwave that could be felt in the chest cavities of sailors on ships sailing in formation miles away. But the power required to launch such mass came from a volatile source. Bags of nitrocellulose propellant stacked like oversized pillows of death behind the projectile. The Iowa was in the twilight of her second life, resurrected from the mothball fleet by President Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy initiative. She was a symbol of American resolve in the final tense years of the Cold War. To the Soviet Union, the reactivation of the Iowa-class battleships was a strategic headache. To the American public, they were floating museums of invincibility, reminders of a time when victory was clear-cut and American industrial might was unquestioned. The ship was beautiful in a terrifying way, her long, slender hull slicing through the water with a grace that belied her 58,000-ton displacement. But beneath the fresh coat of haze gray paint and the newly installed Tomahawk armored box launchers, the Iowa was an old lady. Her keel had been laid in 1940. Her engines were massive General Electric steam turbines that required a priesthood of boiler technicians to maintain. And her main battery, the 9/16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns, relied on a firing process that had not changed fundamentally since the Battle of Jutland. It was a process that demanded perfection from its crew, a synchronized ballet of 80 men moving heavy explosives in a confined space where a single mistake could mean annihilation. On this particular morning, the Iowa was participating in Fleetex 3-89, a massive naval exercise designed to test the fleet's readiness. But for the crew of Turret 2, the stakes felt higher than a routine drill. The commander of the Second Fleet, Vice Admiral Jerome Johnson, was on board. The pressure to perform was palpable. The big stick needed to show that she could still hit hard and shoot straight. The schedule called for a complex firing solution, engaging targets at long range. Inside the center gun room of Turret 2, the atmosphere was tense. The gun captain, gunner's mate second-class Clayton Hartwig, was a 24-year-old sailor known for his meticulous, almost obsessive adherence to procedure. He was the man in charge of the center gun, the one responsible for ensuring that the massive breech was loaded correctly, that the projectile was seated, and that the powder bags were rammed with the precise amount of force required. Hartwig was a man who lived for the Navy, who had polished the brass of his station until it gleamed, who treated the gun with a reverence that some of his shipmates found intense. He stood in the gun pit, a cramped space dominated by the massive breech of the center gun. Around him, the other members of the gun crew, the rammermen, the primal operator, the cradle operator were squeezed into their stations, surrounded by machinery that hissed and groaned with hydraulic pressure. The firing mission for the day was fraught with small, accumulating issues that would later be dissected by investigators and historians alike. The powder being used was D846, a lot of propellant that had been manufactured during the Korean War era. It was old. The Navy had thousands of tons of this propellant in storage, massive silk bags filled with multi-perforated grains of nitrocellulose. Over decades, the ether used to stabilize the propellant could evaporate, leaving the grains potentially unstable, more sensitive to friction, heat, or impact. The bags themselves were stored in canisters in the magazines, deep below the waterline, then sent up via hoists to the gunhouse. As they traveled up the hoist, they passed through a series of flame-proof doors, a safety measure designed to prevent a flash in the turret from reaching the magazines. But once the bags arrived in the gun room, they were exposed. They were vulnerable, and on this day, the specific lot of powder bags had a reputation. They were reportedly packing slightly differently, creating issues with the ramming process. The sequence of events inside the center gun room began routinely enough, or as routinely as one can load a weapon capable of leveling a city block. A massive projectile hoist brought up the 2,700-pound shell. The cradle operator tripped the lever, and the shell rolled onto the spanning tray, a heavy brass trough that bridged the gap between the hoist and the open breech of the gun. The rammerman, gunner's mate third-class Robert Backrams, pulled the lever to extend the hydraulic rammer. With a hiss of fluid, the chain-driven arm shot forward, shoving the heavy projectile deep into the barrel until it bit into the rifling. The sound was a distinctive thud clank, the sound of steel seating against steel. So far, everything was by the book. The rammer retracted. The spanning tray was clear. Now came the powder. The powder hoist door opened, and the powder car arrived, carrying the silk bags of propellant. For this shot, the charge was 5 bags. 5 beige pillows, each weighing nearly 100 pounds, stacked horizontally. The gun crew moved with practiced efficiency, rolling the bags onto the spanning tray. They had to be careful. The bags were soft, but the grains inside were hard cylinders. If a bag tore, loose powder could spill into the breech threads, a recipe for disaster. The bags were aligned. The rammer was ready. This was the critical moment. The rammer had to push the powder bags into the breech, behind the projectile, but it had to be done gently. If you rammed the projectile, you used high-speed velocity. If you rammed the powder, you used low speed. It was a delicate touch with a machine capable of crushing a car. The goal was to push the bags in just far enough so that the breech block could close behind them, but not so hard that you crushed the grains or slammed them against the base of the projectile. But something was wrong. There was confusion in the gun captain's booth. Communications over the sound-powered phones were choppy. There were reports of difficulties with the left gun, delays in the firing sequence. In the center gun room, Hartwig and his crew were holding the load. The powder was on the tray. The breech was open. The air in the turret was dry, incredibly dry, conditioned by the ship's ventilation systems, but devoid of the humidity that naturally suppresses static electricity. In the magazines, the powder was kept in climate-controlled stability. Here, in the gun house, it was exposed to the friction of the hoist, the sliding of the bags against the brass tray, the movement of men in synthetic blend dungarees. Static electricity is a ghost. It builds silently, an accumulation of potential energy waiting for a bridge. A spark gap, a microscopic point of discharge. The order came to load. Backherms engaged the rammer. The hydraulic arm moved forward, pushing the 5 bags of powder into the dark throat of the gun. The bags slid over the smooth steel of the powder chamber, but they didn't go in smoothly. There was resistance. Perhaps the bags were slightly overstuffed. Perhaps they had settled during their decades in storage. The rammer pushed. The bags compressed. Inside those silk casings, the grains of nitrocellulose rubbed against each other. The friction generated heat. The friction generated static charge. The rammer head, a massive block of steel, pressed against the base of the last bag. The specific mechanism of the tragedy likely occurred in the microscopic topography of the powder grains. As the bags were compressed against the projectile base, the sheer physical stress, combined with a sudden discharge of static electricity, accumulated on the bag's surface, created a localized hot spot. It wasn't a spark in the sense of a flint striking steel. It was something more insidious. It was an ether-air combustion within the bag weave itself, ignited by a static discharge that jumped between the bag and the breech, or perhaps between the grains themselves. The ignition point required was infinitesimally small, a few millijoules of energy, the equivalent of the shock you get from a doorknob on a winter day. But inside a bag of D846 propellant, that spark was the catalyst for an apocalypse. At 9:47 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The powder didn't burn. It exploded, but the breech was still open. The massive steel block that was supposed to seal the chamber and direct the force of the explosion out the barrel was swung to the side, resting on its hinges. The path of least resistance for the expanding gas was not down the 66-foot barrel, pushing the projectile. The path of least resistance was backward, into the faces of the gun crew. The physics of the event are difficult to visualize because the human brain struggles to comprehend events that occur in milliseconds. When the powder ignited, it didn't just catch fire. It converted from solid to gas at a rate of thousands of feet per second. The pressure in the open breech spiked instantly to levels that steel could barely contain. A fireball, brighter than the sun and hotter than the surface of Venus, erupted from the open rear of the gun. It wasn't just a flame. It was a physical hammer of superheated gas. In the center gun room, Clayton Hartwig, Robert Backherms, and the other men didn't have time to register fear. They didn't have time to scream. The blast wave hit them traveling at supersonic speed. It stripped the flesh from their bones, incinerated their clothing, and threw their bodies against the rear bulkheads with the force of a car crash. The sheer heat instantly flash-boiled the hydraulic fluid in the lines running along the walls, adding thick, toxic, black smoke to the mix. The explosion didn't stop in the center gun room. The gun house of a battleship turret is divided into 3 sections left. Center, right by armored bulkheads. But these are not airtight seals against a catastrophic overpressure event. The fireball expanded with terrifying veracity. It blasted through the doors into the left and right gun rooms, consuming the crews stationed there. It surged upwards into the officer's booth, where the turret officer and his team were monitoring the exercise. It roared downwards, chasing the oxygen, plunging into the electric deck and the shell-handling platforms. The explosion was looking for more fuel. It found the powder hoist. The design of the turret included safety interlocks. Heavy flapper doors in the hoist meant to slam shut and prevent the flash from traveling down to the magazines. But the speed and violence of this blast tested the limits of 1940s engineering. The fireball raced down the hoist shaft. It passed the electric deck, where men were burned to death instantly where they stood. It reached the bottom of the gunhouse structure. The only thing standing between the death of 47 men and the death of the entire ship was the bravery and quick thinking of the men in the magazines below, and the mechanical fail-safes that, by the grace of God or engineering, held the line. On the bridge, the sensation was a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the deck plates, followed by a slight shudder of the 58,000-ton hull. It wasn't the sharp crack of a 16-inch gun firing. It was deeper, more resonant, a sound that felt wrong in the marrow of the bones of every veteran sailor on board. Captain Mussoli turned his head. What was that? The question hung in the air for a second. Then came the report from the lookouts. Fire in turret 2. The sight that greeted the bridge crew was chilling. The turret was not blown apart. The armor was too thick for that. The explosion had been contained, bottled up. But smoke was pouring from every seam, from the gun barrels, from the ventilation ports. And then, the horror of realization. The turret was silent. No one was answering the squawk box. No one was reporting status. Inside that steel tomb, 47 men were dead or dying, and a fire was raging next to tons of high explosives. The damage control organization of a battleship is a thing of legend. Within seconds, the general quarters klaxon was sounding that rhythmic, piercing gong that bypasses the conscious mind and triggers pure adrenaline. General quarters, general quarters. All hands man your battle stations. Fire in turret 2. The announcement was calm, professional, and terrifying. Sailors dropped their trays in the mess deck, abandoned their racks, and sprinted toward their lockers. This wasn't a drill. The smell of smoke was already being sucked into the ventilation system, spreading the scent of the disaster throughout the ship. But the real battle was happening deep below the waterline, in the powder magazines that fed turret 2. The blast had sent burning debris and sparks down the hoists. If the magazines ignited, the USS Iowa would not just be damaged, she would be vaporized. A magazine detonation of a battleship is a nuclear-scale event without the radiation. It would break the ship's keel, blow the bottom out of the hull, and kill everyone on board in seconds. The sailors in the magazines saw the smoke. They felt the heat. They didn't panic. They acted. With frantic, desperate strength, they dogged down the heavy armored hatches, sealing themselves in with the explosives to keep the fire out, or flooding the magazines to drown the danger. They activated the sprinkler systems, soaking the powder bags in seawater, ruining millions of dollars of ordnance to save the ship. They were listening to the sounds of explosions above them, wondering if the steel ceiling was about to melt and rain fire down upon them. Back on the main deck, the scene was chaotic but controlled. Fire parties were assembling, dragging heavy hoses toward the smoking turret. The metal of the gunhouse was already hot to the touch. The paint was blistering. Inside, The fire was feeding on the hydraulic fluid, the remaining powder bags, and the flammable materials of the cruise station. The smoke was thick, black, and poisonous. Rescue teams in oxygen-breathing apparatus, OBAs, tried to gain entry. They cracked the heavy steel doors at the back of the turret, only to be met by a wall of heat and smoke, so dense their flashlights couldn't penetrate it. They were entering a slaughterhouse. The first responders found bodies stacked against the hatches, men who had tried to escape in the millisecond before the pressure wave crushed them. The interior of the turret was a ruin of twisted metal and charred remains. The heavy machinery, gears the size of tractor tires, was blackened and slick with oil. The center gun room, the epicenter, was a vision of hell. The breech of the center gun was still open, a gaping maw that had vomited death. The spanning tray was twisted. The rammer chain was fused. As the fires were slowly brought under control, the magnitude of the loss began to settle over the ship like a heavy shroud. 47 men. A significant portion of the ship's gunnery department gone. The Iowa, which had survived typhoons and Japanese kamikazes, had been mauled by her own weapon. The invincibility was a lie. The big stick was just a machine, and machines can fail. But the tragedy was just beginning. As the smoke cleared, the Navy began to ask, why? And the answer they would initially settle on would stain the memory of the dead and launch one of the most controversial investigations in naval history. But in those first hours, as the ship turned slowly in the water, her flag at half-mast, the only truth was the silence in Turret 2. The investigation that followed would be a collision of forensic science, bureaucratic self-preservation, and family grief. But to understand the static spark theory, the vindication that would come years later, we have to look closely at the interplay of 1930s chemistry and 1980s procedure. The D846 powder was stable, supposedly, but investigators from Sandia National Laboratories would later discover that when those pellets were fractured, when the ether that stabilized them had leached out over 40 years of storage in hot warehouses and humid magazines, they became temperamental. They became sensitive. The sheer act of shoving them too fast, of over-ramming by 21 inches, a distance measured in the span of a man's forearm, could generate enough friction to wake the dragon. The Navy had assumed that the mechanical safeguards were absolute. They assumed that a spark couldn't jump in the breech. They were wrong. They had forgotten that they were dealing with a chemical compound designed to release massive energy. And that chemistry does not care about the rank of the admiral on the bridge or the legacy of the ship. The irony of the Iowa explosion lies in the clash of eras. The ship was operating in a world of radar-guided defense systems and satellite communications. Yet 47 men died because of a failure in a mechanical loading system that required manual labor and judgment calls. The technology of the battleship was visceral, heavy, and unforgiving. Unlike a missile launch, where a key turn sends a computer code to a circuit board, firing a 16-inch gun involved physically handling the propellant. The crew was intimate with the explosive. They touched the bags. They smelled the ether. They were part of the firing mechanism. And when that mechanism failed, they were the first to pay the price. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic that evening, the Iowa was a wounded animal. The fire was out, but the heat remained, radiating from the steel of Turret 2. The bodies were being recovered, a grim task that required specialized teams to cut through the wreckage. The rest of the crew walked softly, speaking in hushed tones. The invincibility of the battleship had evaporated, replaced by the stark realization of their own mortality. They were floating on a magazine of archaic explosives, and the beast they served had bitten the hand that fed it. The admirals who had touted the return of the battleships as a masterstroke of naval strategy now had to explain why a peacetime exercise had turned into a mass casualty event. The static spark that cooked 47 sailors had also ignited a political firestorm that would eventually consign the battleships to history forever. But before the politics, before the cover-ups and the apologies, there was just the ship, the sea, and the terrible silence of 47 voices silenced in a flash of blinding light. The legacy of the Iowa is often tied to her guns. The power, the range, the destructive potential. But on April 19, 1989, the guns demonstrated a different kind of power, the power of catastrophe. The sheer violence contained within the breech of a Mark VII gun is a testament to the industrial savagery of the 20th century. We built machines to throw mountains at our enemies, and we powered them with chemistry that was barely contained chaos. The static spark was the final variable in an equation that had been unbalanced for decades. Old powder, high pressure, human error, and the relentless physics of combustion. It was a disaster waiting for a catalyst. And when it came, it didn't look like a missile or a torpedo. It looked like nothing at all. An invisible jump of electrons in the dark, triggering a chain reaction that no amount of armor could stop. This was the end of the illusion. The battleship, the ultimate symbol of naval dominance, had been defeated by its own ammunition. The static spark didn't just destroy a turret. It destroyed the mystique. The Admirals could no longer call the Iowa Invincible. She was mortal, flawed, and dangerous to her own crew. The 47 men inside Turret 2 didn't die in combat with a foreign power. They died because the industrial logic of the past collided with the physical realities of the present. They were cooked inside the machine they loved, victims of a technology that had outlived its time. And as the Iowa limped back to port, carrying her dead, she carried with her the heavy burden of a lesson learned in blood. There is no such thing as an invincible ship, only ships that haven't failed yet. The static spark was a reminder that in the face of the elemental forces harnessed for war, we are all just fragile organic matter, waiting for the chemistry to go wrong. The fire in Turret 2 was extinguished, but the heat remained, a thermal ghost haunting the steel. Below the waterline, in the labyrinthine depths of the ship, the damage control teams had performed a miracle of containment. The magazines, stacking thousands of tons of high explosives, had been flooded. Seawater, cold and salty, churned around the silk bags of propellant that had not ignited, ruining them but saving the ship from a detonation that would have registered on seismographs in Puerto Rico. The men who had dogged those hatches, sealing themselves in with the potential for vaporization, sat in the dark, shivering as the adrenaline crashed, listening to the groaning of the ship's hull. The Iowa was heavy now, listing slightly, burdened by the weight of the water pumped into her bellies. She felt sluggish in the Atlantic swell, a boxer who had taken a liver shot and was struggling to keep his hands up. But she was afloat. The invincibility myth was shattered, but the buoyancy held. On the main deck, the sun was high and indifferent, shining on a crew that had been transformed in a single morning from a peacetime exercise force into a congregation of mourners. The smell was the first thing that wouldn't leave. It wasn't just smoke. It was a complex, horrific bouquet of burning hydraulic fluid, melted plastic, charred paint, and the unmistakable, primal scent of burnt biological matter. It permeated the ventilation systems, drifting into the mess decks, the berthing compartments, and the wardroom. It was a sensory reminder that 47 shipmates were still inside the gunhouse, waiting to be retrieved. The turret itself was a crime scene, a tomb, and a hazardous waste site all in one. The exterior paint was blistered and peeling, revealing the raw steel beneath. Smoke still wisped lazily from the gun barrels, which were elevated at an awkward, frozen angle, pointing at a sky they would never threaten again. Captain Mussoli had a ship to command, but he also had a crime scene to preserve. Or at least, that was the procedure. In the chaos of the immediate aftermath, the lines between rescue, recovery, and cleanup blurred. The primary objective was to ensure there were no secondary explosions. The secondary objective was to get the bodies out. The interior of the turret was still lethally hot. Teams of corpsemen and damage control specialists, clad in protective gear that made them look like astronauts from a dystopian future, prepared to enter. They were mostly young men, 19 or 20 years old, kids who had joined the Navy to see the world, get a college fund, or carry on a family tradition. They were not prepared for what waited inside the No. 2 gunhouse. Entering the turret through the rear armored doors was like stepping into a blast furnace that had been used as a meat grinder. The blast wave had not just killed the crew. It had dismantled the interior of the gunhouse. Heavy steel bulkheads were bowed and twisted like wet cardboard. Hydraulic lines had burst, spraying fluid that had then ignited, coating everything in a slick black soot. The lighting was gone, destroyed by the overpressure, so the recovery teams worked by the beams of flashlights that cut through the lingering gloom, illuminating vignettes of horror. They found men fused to their stations. They found bodies that were intact, but stripped of all clothing by the blast wave. Their skin turned the color of ash. They found fragments of what had been a disciplined gun crew, now reduced to biological debris scattered among the gears and hoists. The recovery process was slow, gruesome, and reverent. Each body, or what remained of it, was placed in a body bag. The layout of the turret meant that the dead were stacked on 3 levels: the gun room, the electric deck, and the projectile handling flats. The blast had traveled down the hoist, killing the men on the lower levels just as effectively as those in the gun room, though differently. In the gun room, it was fire and pressure. Lower down, it was toxic gas and thermal shock. The recovery teams had to navigate slippery decks, jagged metal, and the psychological weight of recognizing faces. "That's Jones," someone would whisper. "That's Smith." These weren't anonymous casualties of a distant war. These were the guys they played spades with in the mess hall, the guys they complained about the coffee with. As the bodies were brought out to the fantail, the rear deck of the ship, a hush fell over the Iowa that was heavier than the steel armor belt. The crew formed 2 lines, creating a corridor of honor. There were no bands playing, no speeches, just the sound of the wind, the waves, and the shuffling of boots on the non-skid deck. 47 body bags. It took hours. The sheer logistical scale of the loss began to sink in. 47 men meant 47 empty bunks. It meant 47 families waiting on the pier in Norfolk who didn't know yet. It meant a hole in the ship's roster that couldn't be filled. The bags were placed in refrigerated storage, a grim improvisation, because warships are not designed with morgues for mass casualties. Then came the cleanup. This was the controversial phase, the phase that would later fuel conspiracy theories and accusations of a cover-up. In the immediate aftermath, the command decision was made to clean the turret. Debris was thrown over the side. The deck was scrubbed. Hydraulic fluid was mopped up. On one hand, this was standard Navy damage control. You clean the ship, you maintain order, you prevent fire hazards. On the other hand, it was the destruction of forensic evidence. The position of a lever, the setting of a switch, the location of a specific piece of debris, these could have told the story of what happened. But in the rush to sanitize the horror, much of that subtle evidence was washed away or tossed into the Atlantic. By the time the formal investigators arrived, the crime scene had been altered by the well-intentioned but destructive urge to put the ship back in order. The USS Iowa turned her bow toward Norfolk, Virginia. The journey home was a funeral procession of one. The mood on board was a mix of grief, shock, and a rising corrosive anger. Sailors are superstitious, and they are also deeply cynical about leadership. Rumors began to circulate immediately. The powder was bad. The gunners' mates whispered to each other in the smoking sponsons. We knew that D-846 was unstable. We told them the rammer was fast. Others said Back Herms was having trouble with it all day. The crew knew, instinctively, that this was a mechanical failure, a systemic failure. They blamed the old equipment, the rush to get the firing solution, the pressure from the Admirals. They didn't blame their shipmates. Not yet. But even before the Iowa reached the pier, the narrative was being shaped in Washington. The Navy was in a precarious position. The battleships were the darlings of the Reagan administration, symbols of the peace through strength doctrine. But they were also expensive, manpower-intensive, and critics called them obsolete dinosaurs. If the explosion was caused by a mechanical failure, if the guns were inherently unsafe, or the powder was unstable, then the entire battleship program was at risk. The Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, all of them would be suspect. The cost of replacing the powder or refitting the guns would be astronomical. And politically, it would be an admission that the Navy had sent men to sea in unsafe ships. There was a cleaner, darker alternative. If the explosion was the result of a human act, sabotage, suicide, murder, then the machine was exonerated. The ships were safe. It was just one bad apple. One crazy sailor. As the Iowa steamed toward Norfolk, the Naval Investigative Service NIS was already mobilizing. They weren't looking for a static spark. They were looking for a villain. The arrival in Norfolk on April 22nd was a spectacle of sorrow. The pier was crowded with thousands of people, families, press, brass. President George H.W. Bush was there. He spoke of sacrifice and duty, the standard eulogies of state. The true course of the ship is not determined by the wind and the waves, but by the hand of the helmsman, he said. But for the families of the 47, the rhetoric rang hollow. They wanted to know why their sons were dead. The caskets were offloaded, draped in flags. The crew stood at the rails in their dress blues, a white-hatted wall of solidarity. But among them, the NI's agents were already moving, pulling sailors aside, asking questions that had nothing to do with hydraulic pressure and everything to do with personality, sexuality, and life insurance policies. The investigation that launched was codenamed Judge Advocate General Manual Investigation, or JAGMAN. But the real power lay with the NIS. Their focus narrowed with terrifying speed on the gun captain of the center gun, Clayton Hartwig. Why Hartwig? Because he was in charge. Because he had died at the epicenter. And crucially, because he was different. Hartwig was a loner, intense, socially awkward. He had a fascination with the guns that bordered on the religious. He had befriended another sailor, Kendall Trute, and had named Trute as the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. In the eyes of the NI's agents, desperate for a narrative that cleared the Navy of negligence, these circumstantial crumbs were a feast. They constructed a theory. Hartwig, despondent over a failed homosexual relationship with Trute, a relationship both families denied existed, had decided to commit suicide and take the turret with him. He had supposedly placed an electronic detonator between the powder bags. This theory, which would become the official Navy stance for months, was a masterpiece of confirmation bias. It required ignoring the physics of the explosion and the chemistry of the powder. It required character assassination of a dead man who couldn't defend himself. The NI's interrogation techniques turned brutal. They brought 19-year-old sailors into small rooms and grilled them for hours. Did Hartwig seem depressed? Did he talk about blowing up the ship? Were he and Trute lovers? They threatened young men with charges of accessory to murder if they didn't corroborate the narrative. It was a witch hunt conducted in the name of justice. While the agents were hunting for a phantom saboteur, the technical experts were trying to be heard. Technicians from the naval surface, warfare, center at Dahlgren, the people who actually understood the ballistics of 16-inch guns, were finding troubling evidence. They looked at the debris. They looked at the rammer. The position of the rammer had suggested it had been extended 21 inches past the normal loading position. This was the overram. In a rush to load, or perhaps due to a valve failure, the massive hydraulic arm had pushed the powder bags too far, too fast, 21 inches. It doesn't sound like much, but inside the breech, that distance meant the difference between a gentle seat and a violent crush. The Gun Club, the fraternity of old-school battleship sailors, knew about the overram danger. They knew about the D846 powder. They knew that when you mixed old, dusty propellant with a high-speed compression, you were rolling the dice. But the investigation leadership, headed by Rear Admiral Richard Milligan, wasn't listening to the engineers. Milligan was a surface warfare officer, a cruiserman, not a battleship expert. He was under immense pressure to wrap this up. The Cold War was still on. The Navy needed a conclusion, not a mystery. The investigation began to leak to the press. NBC News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they all began running stories citing unnamed naval sources, suggesting the explosion was an act of sabotage. The headlines shifted from tragedy on the Iowa to suicide pact and jealousy-motivated blast. The Navy was effectively running a PR campaign against its own deceased sailor. They painted Hartwig as a moody, unstable sociopath. They painted Trute as a manipulative beneficiary. The families of the victims were horrified. They were grieving their sons, and now they were being told their sons had been murdered by a shipmate. Inside the technical labs, however, the sabotage theory was falling apart physically, even as it was being built up politically. The NIs claimed they found foreign material in the barrel fragments of a chemical timer, steel wool brake fluid. They argued that Hartwig had fabricated a device to ignite the powder. But when independent chemists looked at the evidence, they found it laughable. The chemical timer fragments were indistinguishable from the normal debris found in a turret bits of seal, lubricant, and standard residue. The steel wool was likely from the scouring pads used to clean the breech. The evidence was being shoehorned to fit the crime. The psychological toll on the surviving crew of turret, the men who had been in the lower decks or had rotated out before the blast, was immense. They were being told that their friend, their leader, was a mass murderer. They knew Clayton. He was weird, sure. He was strict. But a saboteur? It didn't make sense. Hartwig loved the Navy. He loved the Iowa. He had a model of the ship in his room. Sabotaging the turret was the antithesis of everything he stood for. But the relentless pressure from the NIs began to warp memories. Under 12 hours of interrogation, a tired, scared kid might admit that, yes, maybe Hartwig looked a bit sad that morning. Maybe he was quiet. And that maybe became a yes in the official report. The Navy released its first major report in September 1989. It was a bombshell. It formally concluded that the explosion was most probably caused by an intentional act committed by GMG-2 Clayton Hartwig. The report cited the foreign material, the life insurance policy, and a psychological profile constructed by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, who had never met Hartwig. It was a verdict of guilty without a trial. The Navy felt it had solved the problem. The battleships were safe. The powder was fine. The procedures were sound. It was just a crazy sailor. Case closed. But it wasn't closed. Because science is stubborn and grief is powerful. The Hartwig family refused to accept that their son was a mass murderer. The Trute family refused to accept the implication of conspiracy. And critically, members of Congress, specifically the Senate Armed Services Committee, smelled a rat. Senators like Sam Nunn and John Warner began to ask questions. They looked at the report and saw holes. They saw a rush to judgment. They saw a Navy desperate to protect its budget and its reputation at the expense of the truth. The General Accounting Office, GAO, was brought in to review the Navy's investigation. They brought with them scientists from Sandia National Laboratories, the premier explosives experts in the world. These were men who designed nuclear triggers and analyzed terrorist bombings. They didn't care about Navy tradition or the Admiral's career. They cared about physics. When the Sandia scientists looked at the Navy's foreign material evidence, They dismantled it. They proved that the chemical traces the Navy found were naturally occurring byproducts of the explosion and the cleanup. The detonator was a phantom. Then, Sandia turned its attention to the powder. They asked the question the Navy had refused to ask. Could this happen by accident? The Navy said no. They claimed they had tested the powder, and it was stable. Sandia said, "Let's test it again." They built a replica of the breech. They gathered bags of D846 propellant, the exact lot used on the Iowa. They began to simulate the overram. They pushed the bags. Nothing happened. They pushed them harder. Nothing. The Navy smirked. See? Safe. But Sandia kept going. They adjusted the variables. They looked at the trim layer, the small amount of black powder at the base of the propellant bags used to help ignition. They looked at the age of the bags. And then they looked at the speed. The Navy rammer moved at a specific velocity. But what if the bags were slightly misaligned? What if the overram pinched a bag against the breech threads? As the political battle raged in Washington, the USS Iowa remained in service, a haunted ship. The No. 2 turret was sealed, a dead space. The crew went about their duties, but the trust was broken. Every time the guns were fired in the other turrets, there was a flinch, a hesitation. They knew the Navy had lied. They didn't know how or why, but they knew that Hartwig didn't do it. You don't work with a guy for months in a steel box and not know if he's the type to kill everyone. Hartwig was a hard-ass, a stickler for rules. He wasn't suicidal. The narrative felt engineered. The true horror of Block 2 is not just the physical explosion, but the bureaucratic one that followed. It is the story of how an institution, faced with a tragedy of its own making, chose to cannibalize its own people rather than admit a systemic failure. It is the story of 47 dead sailors being denied the dignity of an accidental death, and instead being drafted into a post-mortem narrative of scandal and murder. The static spark was the physical cause, but the institutional arrogance was the accelerant that turned a tragedy into a disgrace. By late 1989, the cracks in the Navy's story were widening. The media, initially compliant, began to turn. Investigative journalists started digging into the stability of D846 propellant. They found reports from the 1940s warning about ether evaporation. They found old gunnery manuals warning about the dangers of overramming. The information had been there all along, buried in the archives, ignored by a Navy that was too in love with the image of the battleship to respect the reality of the machine. The stage was set for a confrontation. On one side, the U.S. Navy establishment, armed with a $50 million investigation and the weight of tradition. On the other side, a grieving family, a skeptical Congress, and a team of scientists in New Mexico, armed with nothing but the scientific method and a few bags of old gunpowder. The Invincible Iowa was about to face her toughest enemy, the truth. The investigation was about to shift from a search for a culprit to a lesson in thermodynamics. The Navy had said, "Can't happen." Sandia was about to prove that, under the right conditions, with the right bad luck, and the right static charge, it absolutely could. And when they did, the explosion in the lab would ring louder than the one in the turret. But for now, the lie held. Hartwig was the villain. The Iowa was the victim. And 47 men lay in graves across America, their epitaphs overshadowed by an asterisk, placed there by the very service they had sworn to defend. The silence in Turret 2 was matched only by the silence of the Navy's conscience. The static spark had done its work, but the cover-up was just getting started. The big stick was rotting from the inside, not from rust, but from deceit. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden history of the ocean's greatest disasters and the mechanical mysteries that claimed sailors' lives, make sure to subscribe to Maritime Tales. We don't just tell you what happened. We take you inside the hull to show you why. Click the subscribe button and the bell icon now. Because the sea never gives up its dead without a story, and you won't want to miss the next one. May 24th, 1990, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1,500 miles from the nearest ocean. In a landscape defined by red dust and scrub brush, the U.S. Navy's lie was about to die a violent death. Inside a reinforced concrete bunker at Sandia National Laboratories, a group of scientists in lab coats and safety glasses stood behind blast glass, watching a vertical steel tower that looked like a guillotine for giants. Suspended at the top of the rig was an 800-pound steel weight, designed to mimic the exact mass and velocity of the USS Iowa's hydraulic rammer. At the bottom, resting on a steel anvil, was a small, unassuming silk bag. It was filled with a handful of black pellets, the trim layer of the 16-inch gun propellant. Specifically, it was D-846, the same lot of Korean War-era powder that had been loaded into the center gun of Turret 2 a year earlier. The Navy had sworn, under oath and before Congress, that this powder was stable. They had sworn that no amount of impact, short of a direct hit by an enemy shell, could detonate it. They had bet their reputation and the soul of Clayton Hartwig on the assertion that only a detonator-sabotaged device could have triggered the blast. Dr. Richard Schwobel, the lead scientist for the Sandia team, gave the nod. The release mechanism clicked. The 800-pound weight dropped. Gravity took over, accelerating the steel mass until it slammed into the powder bag with a sickening thud. For the first few hundred tests, the result had been nothing. Just crushed pellets and disappointment. The Navy observers, standing with their arms crossed, had looked smug, but Schwobel and his team were persistent. They had tweaked the variables. They had adjusted the angle. They had realized that the bags in the turret hadn't just been crushed. They had been pinched and slid simultaneously against the rough brass of the spanning tray and the steel of the breech. They added a small amount of loose powder to the mix, mimicking the grains that inevitably leak from old, fraying silk bags. They adjusted the drop height to match the over-ram speed, that fatal 21-inch mistake. On this drop, the bunker didn't hear a thud. It heard a crack. A flash of orange light erupted from the anvil, instantaneous and violent. The powder hadn't just burned. It had exploded. The high-speed cameras, recording at thousands of frames per second, captured the truth that the Admirals had tried to bury. The friction of the impact, combined with the instability of the ether-depleted pellets, had generated a microscopic fracture in a single grain. That fracture created a hot spot. That hot spot ignited the surrounding ether gas, and in the confined pressure of the test rig, just like in the confined pressure of the gun breech, physics took over. There was no timer. There was no battery. There was no suicidal sailor. There was only physics. The static spark theory wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a reproducible fact. In the silence that followed the blast in the Albuquerque bunker, the entire edifice of the Navy's investigation, the foreign materials, the psychological profiles, the shadowboxing with a dead man's reputation collapsed into dust. The Invincible battleship had been killed by its own ammunition, and the cover-up had been blown apart by a drop test in the desert. To understand how we got to that bunker, we have to rewind to the political battlefield of late 1989. The Navy had released its initial report, blaming Hartwig, hoping the story would fade. It did the opposite. The families of the victims, particularly the Hartwigs and the Troots, had launched a media counteroffensive that was unprecedented in military history. They went on 60 Minutes. They spoke to the Washington Post. They didn't act like grieving passive victims. They acted like prosecutors. They demanded the evidence. And when the Navy stonewalled, Congress stepped in. The Senate Armed Services Committee, led by the formidable Sam Nunn, was not interested in protecting the Navy's ego. They were interested in why 47 voters were dead. They saw the Navy's investigation for what it was, a conclusion in search of evidence. The foreign material that the Navy claimed was a chemical detonator became the focal point of the skepticism. The Navy had found traces of calcium, chlorine, and iron in the barrel. They argued these were the remnants of a sophisticated timing device Hartwig had built. When Sandia chemists analyzed these foreign materials, the results were almost comedic if the context wasn't so tragic. The calcium and chlorine turned out to be calcium hypochlorite, the active ingredient in the decontaminating solution used by the damage control teams to clean the turret after the fire. The iron fibers were consistent with steel wool, which sailors used by the gallon to scrub the gun breech. The glycol traces? Brake fluid from the hydraulic recoil system that had burst and flooded the room. The Navy had literally scooped up the garbage from their own cleanup operation, put it in a bag, and called it a bomb. It was forensic incompetence on a staggering scale, driven by the desperate need to find a villain. But the real turning point was the propellant itself, the D846 powder. The Navy had 20,000 bags of this stuff sitting in warehouses. It was left over from the 1950s. Gunpowder, or more accurately smokeless propellant, is not wine. It does not get better with age. It consists of nitrocellulose pellets. To keep them from degrading too fast, manufacturers add a stabilizer, usually diphenylamine. But over decades, the stabilizer gets used up as it neutralizes the decomposition byproducts. When the stabilizer is gone, the powder becomes autocatalytic. It starts to heat up and break down on its own. The D846 lot was known to be hot. It burned faster than it should. But the more dangerous issue was the ether. The pellets were formed using a solvent of ether and alcohol. Over 40 years, the ether slowly evaporated. As the ether left, the pellets became brittle. They developed microfractures, and crucially, they became drier. Dry things build up static electricity. Wet things don't. The humidity inside the sealed bags was supposed to be controlled, but 40 years is a long time. Sandia's team, led by Schwabel, realized that the Navy's loading procedure was a recipe for disaster. The overram was the key. When the rammerman, Backrooms, pushed the bags into the breech, he didn't just push them. The hydraulic ram drove them in with thousands of pounds of force. Because of the delay and confusion that morning, the rammer might have been moving at its high-speed setting, not the slow speed required for powder. The overram of 21 inches meant the bags were crushed against the base of the projectile. Imagine a bag of marbles. If you press them gently, they shift. If you smash them with a hammer, they shatter. The old D846 pellets shattered. Fresh surfaces were exposed. The friction of the pellets rubbing against each other generated heat. At the same time, the synthetic silk of the bag, sliding against the brass tray and the steel breech, generated a static charge. In a modern bag, this charge would dissipate. But in a dry, ether-depleted bag, it accumulated. The spark didn't need to be a lightning bolt. It just needed to be enough to ignite the ether vapor trapped inside the bag weave. Once the ether lit, the pressure inside the breech, which was blocked by the projectile in front and the rammer head behind, spiked. The burning ether ignited the black powder trim layer. The black powder ignited the nitrocellulose. And because the pellets were fractured, they had more surface area. More surface area means faster burning. Faster burning means explosion. The Navy had argued this sequence was impossible. The probability is 1 in a billion, they told Congress. Sandia's drop tests proved that with the specific conditions present on the Iowa, the bad powder, the overram, the trim layer configuration, the probability wasn't 1 in a billion. It was terrifyingly high. It was inevitable. The Senate hearings in May 1990 were the climax of the drama. The Navy brass sat at the witness table, stiff in their dress whites, their chests covered in ribbons. Opposite them sat the scientists from Sandia, in cheap suits and ties, armed with charts and high-speed video. It was a massacre. Senator Nunn grilled the admirals. You stated that the foreign material could only be a detonator. Sandia says it's brake fluid. How do you explain this? The admirals stammered. They tried to fall back on rank and experience. Senator, we know ships. We know our men. But they didn't know chemistry. Then they played the video. The drop test. The hearing room watched in silence as the weight fell and the powder exploded. There was no detonator in the video. Just impact. The visual evidence was undeniable. The sabotage theory evaporated in that room. The Navy's Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Carlisle Trost, looked like a man watching his career burn down. The implication was clear. The Navy had accused a dead man of mass murder to cover up for the fact that they were using unsafe ammunition in an unsafe gun. The reversal was painful and slow. The Navy didn't apologize immediately. Institutions rarely do. But in October 1991, nearly 2.5 years after the explosion, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Frank Kelso, formally apologized to the family of Clayton Hartwig. He stated that there was no clear and convincing evidence of sabotage. The official cause of the explosion was changed to undetermined. It was a weasel word, a legalistic shield, but it was a victory for the families. Hartwig's name was cleared. The life insurance money was paid. The suicide pact narrative was relegated to the trash heap of history. But the damage to the battleship program was fatal. The investigation had revealed that the 16-inch guns, the pride of the fleet, were temperamental beasts that required a level of care and maintenance the modern Navy could no longer guarantee. The expertise was gone. The Master Chiefs, who knew how to feel the powder in 1945, were retired or dead. The new generation was doing their best, but they were working with manuals, not intuition, and the machinery was unforgiving. The Iowa was decommissioned in October 1990, even before the final apology. Her sister ships, the Wisconsin and the Missouri, followed soon after. The static spark didn't just cook 47 sailors. It sank the entire class. The age of the battleship ended not with a bang of glory against a Soviet battlecruiser, but with a forensic report in a Senate hearing room. The tragedy of the USS Iowa also forced a reckoning with the military's justice system. The Jagman investigation was exposed as a tool of command influence, not an impartial search for truth. The agents of the NIS, now NCIS, were dragged over the coals for their interrogation tactics. The fact that they had bullied grieving 19-year-olds into false confessions was a stain on the service. Changes were made. Procedures were updated. But for the men of Turret 2, it was too little, too late. The scientific victory of Sandia National Laboratories highlighted a dangerous disconnect in modern warfare. As technology advances, the gap between the user and the physics widens. The sailors on the Iowa were pushing buttons and pulling levers, but they didn't understand the molecular decay happening inside the silk bags they handled. The admirals on the bridge understood strategy, but they didn't understand that a 1940s propellant stabilizer had a shelf life. The Invincible moniker was a product of hubris. They believed that because the ship was big and the armor was thick, it was safe. They forgot that the most dangerous thing on a warship isn't the enemy. It's the energy you carry with you. In the years following the investigation, the survivors of the Iowa explosion formed a tight-knit community. They were bound by the trauma of the blast and the trauma of the accusation. They had to fight two wars, one against the fire in the turret and one against the lies of their own government. Kendall Trute, the man accused of being the beneficiary of a suicide plot, lived under a cloud of suspicion for years. He was vindicated, but the scars remained. You don't get over being accused of conspiring to kill 46 of your friends. The static spark theory is now the accepted historical fact. But even the term static spark minimizes the event. It sounds small. A shock from a doorknob. What happened on the Iowa was a catastrophic alignment of systemic failures. It was the failure of logistics, keeping old powder. It was the failure of training, the overram. It was the failure of leadership, the pressure to fire. And finally, it was the failure of integrity, the cover-up. As we look back at the science of the disaster, it becomes a terrifying lesson in probability. The Navy fired thousands of 16-inch rounds in World War II in Korea. Why didn't it happen then? Perhaps because the powder was fresher. Perhaps because the crews were more experienced. Or perhaps it did happen and was lost in the chaos of war, attributed to enemy fire. But in 1989, in the calm waters of the Atlantic, there was nowhere to hide. The machine failed in plain sight. The Iowa explosion serves as a grim milestone in the history of naval engineering. It marks the moment when the brute force era of warfare finally ceded ground to the scientific reality of materials. You can build a turret with 17 inches of steel armor, but you cannot armor it against the laws of chemistry. If the ether evaporates, the powder becomes a bomb. If the static builds, the bomb goes off. The armor that was designed to keep Japanese shells out ended up keeping the pressure in, focusing the blast, ensuring that the mortality rate in the center gunroom was 100%. The 47 men who died were not just victims of an accident. They were martyrs to an obsolete technology and a bureaucracy that refused to let it go. They were serving on a museum piece that had been drafted back into the front lines. The Navy wanted the Iowa to be a symbol of strength. Instead, she became a symbol of fragility. The static spark revealed that beneath the iron skin of the battleship, there was a rot of old ammunition and old ideas. Block 3 closes with the image of the empty testing bunker in New Mexico. The smoke from the successful drop test has cleared. The scientists are shaking hands, not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of men who have solved a puzzle that killed 47 people. They have the truth. Now, the question is what the world will do with it. The lie is dead. The battleship is dying. But the story of the Iowa is not quite over. There remains the memory, the memorial, and the lingering question that haunts every sailor who steps onto a ship of war. Do the people in charge actually know what they are doing, or are they just crossing their fingers and hoping the powder doesn't blow? The vindication of Clayton Hartwig was absolute, but it was posthumous. He couldn't hear the apology. He couldn't see the report. All he knew in that final fraction of a second was the blinding light of the breach and the failure of the system he had dedicated his life to. The Navy had called him a murderer. Science proved he was just a sailor, standing at his post, doing his job. When the physics of 1940 collided with the reality of 1989, the static spark was the executioner. But the Navy's negligence signed the death warrant. Today, the USS Iowa sits quietly at berth 87 in the port of Los Angeles. She is no longer a commissioned warship, but a museum, a floating monument to a century of naval history. Tourists in shorts and sunglasses walk her teak decks, aiming their cameras at the massive 16-inch barrels that once leveled hillsides in Korea and shelled Japanese industrial centers. They marvel at the sheer size of the vessel, the analog complexity of her fire control computers, and the cramped quarters where sailors lived and died. But when they reach the forward deck, there is a hesitation. They stop before number 2 turret. There is no visible damage from the outside. The steel was repainted long ago, but the aura of the place is heavy. A plaque lists 47 names. It is a roll call of the lost, a permanent reminder that this industrial cathedral was also a slaughterhouse. The turret itself remains a sealed tomb. Inside, the damage from April 19, 1989 has largely been left untouched. The scorched bulkheads, the twisted metal of the hoist, the shadows where men stood for the last time, it is all preserved in the dark. A time capsule of the exact moment the Invincible lie collapsed. The Navy never repaired Turret 2. There was no point. By the time the investigation concluded, the age of the battleship was over. The cost to fix it would have been millions, but the cost to the Navy's soul had already been paid. Leaving it broken was, perhaps unintentionally, the most honest thing the Navy could do. It stands as a physical scar on the ship, a jagged wound that refuses to heal, testifying that even the mightiest machines are vulnerable to the smallest failures. The decommissioning of the Iowa-class battleships in the early 1990s was the direct, inevitable consequence of the explosion, while the official reason given was the peace dividend following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The truth was written in the forensic reports from Sandia. The battleships were too old, too labor-intensive, and fundamentally unsafe in a modern context. They were analog monsters in a digital world. The explosion proved that the institutional knowledge required to operate them safely had evaporated. The old salt chiefs who could smell bad powder or hear a misaligned hoist were gone. The new Navy, obsessed with missiles and electronics, had lost the tactile connection to the mechanics of heavy gunnery. The static spark didn't just ignite the powder. It illuminated the obsolescence of the entire platform. For the families of the 47, the vindication provided by the apology was a bitter victory. They had fought the U.S. government and won, but their prize was a folded flag and a lifetime of what-ifs. The parents of Clayton Hartwig had to endure their son being branded a mass murderer on national television, his name dragged through the mud by the very institution he loved. Even after the apology, the whisper campaign lingered in dark corners of the internet and naval bars. There's no smoke without fire, people would say, clinging to the sabotage theory because it was easier to believe in a villain than in a random, meaningless accident. It is a dark quirk of human psychology. We prefer a narrative of malice to a narrative of chaos. If Hartwig did it, there is a reason. If it was a static spark, it is just terrifyingly random. The legacy of the Iowa disaster reshaped the U.S. Navy's approach to safety and investigation. The culture of cover-up that had allowed the NIS to railroad the investigation was exposed to the light. The creation of independent oversight bodies and the reformation of accident investigation protocols can be traced back to the Senate hearings, where Admiral Milligan was dismantled by science. The Navy learned painfully that in the information age, you cannot control the narrative if the physics don't support it. You cannot order a chemical reaction to be a crime scene if it was actually an accident. The JAGMAN investigation manual was rewritten. The way the Navy treats the families of the fallen was overhauled. But beyond the bureaucracy, the Iowa explosion is a cautionary tale about the worship of machines. A battleship was a totem. It represented American invincibility. It was the big stick. The Admirals fell in love with the symbol and forgot the reality. They forgot that the ship was a collection of valves, seals, gaskets, and chemical compounds, all of which were subject to entropy. They pushed the ship and her crew to perform for the cameras, for the VIPs, for the FleetX scoreboards, ignoring the warning signs of aging equipment and unstable ammunition. They treated the Iowa like a god, immune to the laws of nature. But gravity, friction, and thermodynamics are atheists. They do not care about prestige. The explosion also highlighted the intense, claustrophobic brotherhood of the gun turret. The 47 men who died were a tribe within a tribe. They lived together, ate together, and worked in a space that was closer to a factory floor than a ship's bridge. They were turret rats. The bond between them was forged in the grease and the heat. When the blast hit, it took entire social circles. It wiped out the spades game, the smoking circle, the workout group. The survivors, the men who were on leave or stationed elsewhere in the ship, carried a survivor's guilt that was crushing. Why wasn't I there? I traded shifts with Jones. I should have been on the rammer. These are the ghosts that walk the decks of the museum ship today, old men now, touching the steel and remembering the voices that were silenced in a millisecond. The Iowa disaster also serves as a grim final chapter to the story of gunpowder. For 500 years, naval warfare was defined by the combustion of propellant to throw a projectile. From the galleons of the Spanish Armada to the dreadnoughts of Jutland, the principle was the same. The Iowa was the peak of this technology, the ultimate expression of the cannon. And it was the cannon that killed her. The future of naval warfare belonged to the railgun, the laser, the missile technologies that moved away from the volatile, dirty, unpredictable nature of chemical explosives. The static spark was the death knell of the powder navy. It was the universe saying, "You have pushed this technology as far as it can go, and now it is biting back." In the quiet of the museum ship at night, when the tourists are gone, and the harbor lights of Los Angeles reflect off the black water, the Iowa seems to dream. She dreams of the Pacific in 1944, of the typhoons, of the kamikazes she swatted from the sky. But deep in her forward section, there is a nightmare that does not fade. The nightmare of April 19th, 1989. The nightmare of the overram. The nightmare of the spark. It is a reminder that the line between a weapon of war and a self-destructive machine is vanishingly thin. The story of the USS Iowa is not just a story about a ship. It is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. It has the hubris of the Admirals, the betrayal of the loyal sailor, the false accusation, the grieving families, and the final, undeniable revelation of truth through science. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not for the glory of the battleship, but for the fragility of the men inside it. We often use the word hero loosely. The men of Turret 2 were heroes, but not in the way the Navy recruitment posters promise. They didn't die charging a machine gun nest or saving the world from tyranny. They died doing the hard, dirty, dangerous work of maintenance and training. They died because they trusted their equipment and their leaders. They were the blue-collar workers of war, crushed by the industrial machinery they served. Their heroism lies in their dedication to a job that, in the end, betrayed them. As we leave the Iowa, walking down the gangway back to the safety of the pier, we should look back at the massive gun barrels one last time. They are silent now, plugged and painted. They will never fire again. They are monuments to a different time, a time of maximum effort and total war, but they are also headstones. 47 headstones rising from the deck. And if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the superstructure, you might hear the echo of the lesson the Iowa taught the world. There is no such thing as an invincible ship. There is only the sea, the science, and the fragile lives of the sailors who stand between them. The static spark that cooked 47 sailors inside was invisible to the naked eye. It was a ghost in the machine. But its impact was visible to the entire world. It stripped away the armor of the U.S. Navy and revealed the human cost of negligence. It forced a superpower to apologize to a dead boy. And it ensured that the big stick would never be wielded in anger again. The guns of the Iowa are cold, but the memory of the fire burns on. So the next time you see a battleship in a movie or a model on a shelf, remember the Iowa. Remember not just the power, but the price. Remember Clayton Hartwig, a man who loved the Navy enough to die for it, and who was loved by his family enough to be saved from it. And remember that in the end, the truth is the only thing that is truly invincible. This has been the story of the USS Iowa turret explosion. A story of fire, lies, and physics. If you want to uncover more of the maritime world's darkest secrets and most heroic moments, you know what to do. The ocean is deep, and the stories are endless. We'll see you on the next tide.